Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kim Tavares from the Miami University Alumni Association, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Miami Women Presents Women and the Power of Age Diversity. Now, you might notice this is a little bit different title than we've done for some of our webinars. What is Miami Women? Miami Women is the Miami initiative for advancing, mentoring, and investing in women. Working with our campus partners, we provide networking and professional development opportunities for all Miami women, virtually and in person. And in fact, if you're watching this and live near Cleveland, we're going to be there next week on the 26th for a lunchtime event in person, and registration is still open. We also help to fund programs throughout campus that impact faculty, staff, and students. As you can see here, the need is great. We had a record number of applications this year, and the need was very much there. We had $100,000 to give our 9 finalists, and we can't do this without our members. It's $1,000 a year, and you get invitations to special events. And most importantly, you get to vote in Hawk Tank, which tells you get to decide where your money goes. So any gift is important. The entire program is important and offers a lot of great opportunity, and I hope you check it out online. And our presenter today, Megan Gerhardt. Hi, Megan. She is intimately familiar with the Miami Women as she serves on our grants committee, and she's been a presenter at several of our programs in person, and we're so happy to have her back today. Megan Gerhardt is a professor of management and leadership at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University, where she also serves as director of leadership development for the Farmer School and the Robert D. Johnson co-director of the Isaac and Oxley Center for Business Leadership. Megan has published widely on generational differences in the workplace and is the author of the book, Gentelligence, the Revolutionary Approach to Leading an Intergenerational Workforce, which she co-authored with 2 Miami alums, Josephine, I'm not going to get her name right. Ekwall, thank you, 18, and Brandon Fogel, class of 18. And they did a presentation with her during Winter College previously for us. Her Gentelligence work has been featured in Harvard Business Review, NBCnews.com, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, The San Francisco Chronicle, Market Watch, The Houston Chronicle, and Inc. magazine, among others. And in 2017, her TEDx talk, Why I Love Millennials and You Should Too, was released. Dr. Gerhardt's work focuses on leveraging differences to achieve impact and extraordinary levels of performance. Megan, so great to see you again. Thank you so much for doing another webinar for us. Before I turn it over to you, I'm going to let the audience know that if you're watching live, you can ask questions and submit comments during the live broadcast. You can just click on the Ask a Question link below your video player. And I'll be back at the session to present your questions and thoughts to Megan. So Megan, take it away.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everyone. I appreciate being invited back. I love doing these webinars for Miami Alumni Association and, of course, Miami Women, a cause near and dear to my heart. So we're here today. Thank you to those of you who are joining us again. So we've done a number of talks on Gentelligence, which, as Kim said, is the topic of a lot of my research and book, which I'll get into in a little bit. But we wanted to take this one in a slightly different direction based on some new work I'm doing, and also just to keep extending the conversation to a deeper level of maybe how to think about how your age, as well as other parts of your identity, specifically your gender, may interact in order to create differences in your perspective, your experiences, your norms, all of those fantastic things. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to kick off. You can see there, I dug into the Miami University archives for this talk today and found some really incredible pictures of women from Miami throughout Miami's history. So I had such a great time the last couple of days finding these, so that they're sprinkled throughout our conversation. So I want to start just with a really quick origin story, which I always do, about why I am so passionate about this topic. And it really does stem from my work here at Miami as a professor. This is, I just had my 18th graduation ceremony on Sunday, and just, of course, have the honor of being a professor here of management and leadership. And so my passion for this topic really comes from the fact that I learn a significant amount from my older colleagues as well as my students every single day. And that's been the case my entire career. I see such power and potential in learning in both directions. And it's led me to really figure out why that mentality is not more prevalent in our workplaces and in our society. And I'm going to dig into that today and add this interesting layer of gender to our conversation as well. So I'm just going to a quick baseline conversation. We're going to talk about age today, but I talk about age and generations in my work as obviously being really closely linked. So for those of you who tuned in and this is your first generational conversation or the first one where you've really been thinking about this, I wanted to get us all on the same page. These are the generational categories that I use. So they're all taken from the Pew Research Center. So that gives us kind of a consistent framework to use. We like to say 5 generations in our workplace today, but 6 generations in our society. Actually, probably 7, although we're still trying to figure out what to call the generation after Gen Z. So I would say we have 7 complete generations, probably 5 that are actively in our workforce. And we're still figuring out what comes after Gen Z. We've heard Gen Alpha because when you start generations and naming generations with X, you run out of letters pretty quick. So in a lot of the work that I do, you can see an overview of these different generations, but I think it's important to talk about the fact that I don't believe in generational stereotypes. So a lot of you maybe who have been through generational training or have had generational exposure before, sometimes it turns people off because a lot of times it's very surface level where people are told that because you're a baby boomer, because you're a Gen Xer, here's the events that influenced your life, here's your attitudes, and here's the behaviors that you demonstrate, which of course is very simplistic. It's not accurate for most of the people in a generation. And it makes people feel, like they're being generalized in a way that doesn't really fit their experience. And so I don't believe in that. I do believe that generational identity, however, is a really interesting and important layer of your experience, and understanding someone's generation can help you understand perhaps why they have a different perspective than you do. So that's a really thin line. So I like to talk about generational narratives. I do love to talk about different events that have shaped a generation that everyone in that generation did experience, but probably not in the same way. Because that helps us understand why we do see some interesting group level norms shift, for example, between my generation, Gen X, and a millennial. So I do believe in generational categories because I think it's very important to help ground yourself in the fact that your lived experience in many ways is different from other people. And here's one way that we can certainly pull out and talk about and use as a starting point to really inquire to people about how their perspectives have been shaped by their lived experience, in part, the time in history in which they grew up. So I have a lot of things out there about the different narratives in different generations. I don't want to take our limited time today to talk about that, but do want to talk a little bit about how a generational identity forms. So this is a favorite quote of mine. If you think about people who are similar in age to you, so a generation is between 15 and 20 years usually, they might have been a little older or younger than you when certain key events happened, but you grew up in a time when there were certain parenting norms. Things were going on in the economy, in pop culture, socially, historically, things happening that are going to shape the path ahead. And you share those experiences with people who grow up in a common time in history. And that does certainly have some interesting data verified impacts on the way that you see the world. So this is a quick connect the dots on where generational identity comes from. So there's a big line of academic research on identity theory. So shared experiences. We all go through experiences. So if we take, for example, the pandemic. Yes, we've all been living through the pandemic, but research would tell us that the children and young adults age, let's say 5 to 20, who have lived through it during their most formative years, this event of the pandemic will have the most significant impact on them long term. It is changing fundamentally every road ahead of them, from what it means to work, the opportunities they have, their view of things like risk. and stability. And as a result, yes, it's had a profound effect on many of us, but as a group, that generation will have the most significant long-term impacts for that. So those shared early experiences lead to some interesting differences in what we call internalized values and norms. So if we look at Gen Xers as opposed to, millennials or baby boomers, there are some significant statistical differences and some key attitudes that were shaped by formative events. Not every person in that generation obviously has that same attitude or behavior, but there's enough of a difference that we can look at trends and find them notable. And those result in things that we see in the workplace and our family dynamic, where we say, well, that's different. And that I'm not sure how I feel about it. Often we say that's different and I don't like it, right? So that's kind of what we're here to dig into today. So to get to the women and generational interaction that brought us all here today, I like to think of generations as one layer of your identity. So the idea of a layered approach to identity means there are obviously many, many facets to who you are and what has influenced your view of the world. Generation is one. But I also say age is one. So for example, if you are a younger baby boomer versus an older baby boomer, or you're a young millennial, or what they're now calling a geriatric millennial, which I think is sort of horrible. They're just doing that to create clickbait, but that kind of idea that, of course, you've probably had a very different experience as a member of that generation based on age. So age is another layer. And then the one we're here to talk about today specifically is gender. And when Miami Women and the Miami Alumni Association reached out to me about this, I was happy to come speak to this because it's come up numerous times over the last year. I've been doing a lot of speaking to different companies since the book came out, and then the Harvard Business Review article that came out in March. There's been a lot of interest in sort of planting the seed about age diversity in organizations. And often, whether I'm speaking with a women's group or any group, we start to talk about how different layers of identity interact. So we'll talk about gender from this point out, but think about other things like socioeconomic status. When we talk about millennials being entitled, that's much more of a reputation that comes from very high socioeconomic millennials. And I say they're proactive, not entitled, in case, that's important for me to point out. It depends on where you're standing, right? But also things like culture. Right? Globally, we don't define generations the same way. We don't look at age the same way. We have different formative cultural events that are impacting how we define generations. So you can continue that list, right? That of course we see, race and ethnicity and all different things. Where you grew up, even geographically, can have a really big difference. So, but let's get to gender, which of course is what brings us here today. So I asked this question in a workshop I did for a company last fall. And was really blown away by the conversation and the discussion that it generated. So I want you all to think about this for yourselves, and certainly happy to take questions or things like that, as Kim said, as we get to the end of the webinar. But how has your gender and your generation interacted to shape your experiences, norms, and perspectives? So in the webinar that or the workshop I gave last fall, I did a breakout where I just randomly, it wasn't a women's group per se, but I broke people up into breakout rooms. And in a particular breakout room, there happened to be all females. And in that group, we had 2 Gen Zs, a Gen Xer, baby boomer, just a couple millennials. It was a very multi-generational group, which was great. And when they came back, I just said, what were some of the highlights and points that you talked about in terms of how your generation has shaped your viewpoint? And this group, because it happened to be all women, it was interesting. One of the Gen Z participants said, I was fascinated and my eyes were opened by the experience and the viewpoint that the woman in our breakout, who was a baby boomer, shared. So the story was, really quickly, that the baby boomer female worked in the media industry. So she worked in television, I believe. And she was sharing with the younger members of her breakout group that, obviously the norms of being in the workplace were very different when she started her career. She was one of very few women in her industry. And she said, there was a lot of unacceptable behavior going on in the workplace at that time. And it's not that it was okay with us or that we, were more accepting of it. It's that the norm was you didn't say anything. And the reality was, if we said something, we probably wouldn't have that job for very long. The dynamics were different. The politics were different. The social, acceptability was different. And so it led to a really interesting conversation with her younger group mates who I think maybe had a perception that, maybe it wasn't a big deal when something like was unacceptable happened or harassment happened in the workplace for women decades ago. And this woman said it was always a big deal, of course, but we weren't encouraged to speak up. And in fact, it was the opposite. And there were real, consequences to your career path or your future, your ability to get another job if you did. And so it just led to this really great, not right or wrong discussion, but a discussion about difference. So I always like to ask people to think about, how might those things have influenced your perspective? And so here's where I'll show you that I went digging in the Miami archives here and had such a great time. So I found so many great pictures online. So of course, and Kim can jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But of course, we had the Women's College on Western Campus here at Miami, which of course we still have those beautiful buildings today as part of our main campus. But think about being a female student at Western and at the Women's College, and then when it became, Miami became co-ed, and how certain opportunities were or weren't available to women. As I clicked through and just saw, the different decades. So this is the Western Female Seminary in 1890. This is a faculty photo. So I was like thinking what I would look like in one of those outfits. I think it would be pretty great. And, Kim, just a suggestion maybe that the Alumni Association get us some of those. And I think that could be a trend we could bring back. But you can see, I wear that bun often though, so that, I think I would fit in there. I thought this was a fantastic photo. I might actually put it on my wall because I loved it so much. But what a different experience, but probably similar in some ways. So I found some other ones here. The one on the left is from the 1950s. And then on the right, of course, Freedom Summer. So that was from the 1960s here on campus. This I thought was really interesting. So this is a snapshot from a Miami University yearbook where they show Dr. Naomi Brown from the Oxford Female College, who was Dean of Women. And there's the Assistant Dean of Women, 3 of them. And these pictures were right under an individual who was called the Dean of Students. So I thought it was really interesting. We had a Dean of Students, and then there were a Dean of Women. So obviously some of the people on the call might remember and have been part of this. And so just such an interesting, rich remembering, sort of how things have changed. And then just fast forwarding up here to 1980, I was going through the Miami Athletics site and looking for pictures of female athletes, and found basically none until the 70s for this reason. So there were a few, I shouldn't say none, but there were very few pictures of, Miami women's sports on the athletic site until the 70s. And so this is from 1980. I thought her skirt was fantastic. But of course, we're coming up on now the 50th anniversary of Title IX, I believe, as well, which of course is a big deal. So, start to see sort of what opportunities did Miami women have after this that they didn't have before. My dear friend Susan Noss, who has been such a gift to Miami and attended here with her husband, she shared with me during one of her visits and shared with my students how, her 2 options when she was a student here were really nursing and education. And so, she became a CPA eventually, but those, my students their eyes were so open by the fact that opportunity to become a CPA was one she had to pursue later. So again, just a really, I think, important note for all of us to think about. So we think about so much opportunity, right? About the rich history we have, of course, here on campus. I think about the gift it is when we have alumni come back to campus. I've done women in leadership conferences here through the Center for Business Leadership, where we had both male and female alums come and meet with our students. And we talked about the importance of supporting women in the workplace and just the different experiences that my students were exposed to and how much they learned from our alums. But also, Gentelligence, which I'll talk about just in a minute, is about opening our eyes to the fact that there's opportunity in both directions. So yes, older people teaching experience and insight and expertise to younger people, but also the opposite. And so what might our students today be able to teach and share with our older alums? And how might women across different ages in particular empower each other in terms of learning and support and experience in general, but also specifically about how the role of gender in the workplace has been evolving over time, what issues still exist, what issues have we made progress on. And so I wanted to share this quote. It's from actually a 1996 academic article, but it talks about the fact that we have this really unique ability if we think about age and generation as a unique form of diversity, which often we don't, right? If you think about your organization, if you're in the workforce and your organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging strategy, does it include age? Data on this is really hard to find. We're working on updating it. I'm working with some former students on this. When we published our HBR piece, the most widespread article we could find was from 2014, which said only 8% of companies included age in their DE&I strategies. So that's pretty dated, but even if it's doubled since then, that's still only 16%. That's really low for a kind of diversity, a kind of difference that is in every organization, and we have no control over our age. So it is a key demographic aspect that should be valued and leveraged. And unfortunately, that's pretty rare. So we kind of paint this picture now, and I want to talk a little bit about what Gentelligence is, and then weave in sort of how, from a gender and generation perspective, we could be smarter and maybe more powerful if we tap into these kinds of difference together. So the reality is, when we hear about generations in the workplace and when we hear about age, the conversation is usually pretty negatively charged. Ageism has been called the last acceptable form of bias, meaning it's one that people talk more openly about. This is also true with generations. Anybody who's heard the phrase "okay boomer" or "entitled millennial" or "Gen Z snowflake" or "Gen X slacker," pick your generational insult, understands, right? People think it's funny. It's the stuff clickbait media is made of, but it's a very lazy way to think about age and generational difference. And I like thinking about generational differences as a form of diversity, but also a form of culture. Culture is basically the way we think about someone who's grown up in a different way than we have, which of course is a perfect description of different age groups and generations. So if we know that there's this great richness that comes from growing, being a Miami student in the 1960s versus 2022, think about the different things you were exposed to and you've learned and you know how to do and your views. And there's that richness, but then there's a richness that might come from sharing those points of view. But we're not really encouraged to do that. There's no proactive strategies in place for us to do that. In a two-way kind of direction where we champion that experience of all generations. So let's talk about maybe how Gentelligence will allow us to do this. So for those of you, if this is your first time tuning in, you've heard me throw that word out. Gentelligence is a word I coined back in 2017. Hopefully it's self-explanatory when you hear it. That was kind of the point. But the definition there, it's a collective intelligence. It means we're smarter when we leverage those experiences, that expertise across ages. And if we stop looking at it as a threat, right, that someone older than me or younger than me is somehow in competition with me for opportunities or for clout or for status or for anything. And instead we shift the lens and we shift our frame and say, well, what if instead we could collaborate? What if I'm here to learn from those older than me, but also those younger than me? And hopefully they want to learn from me in return. What could we accomplish personally, but then also what do we accomplish as an organization, right? I can't tell you the number of things I've learned from my students. I got a compliment on my slides yesterday from a colleague of mine. I said, thank you. My students taught me how to use Canva. I use Canva for all my slides. I think they taught me 5 years ago or something like that. And now I use it for everything, but I learned that from them because I was open to learning it from them. So where are the opportunities if we're willing to learn from each other is the real question. Here's some of the research supported opportunities in age and generational diversity. I'm going to use them a little bit interchangeably now just for simplicity's sake. So complementary abilities and skills. The fact is we all learn something different depending on when we grow up and are acquiring the majority of our knowledge. We, of course, continue hopefully learning throughout our lifetime, but the learning curve for us is bigger later in life, right? You're kind of a sponge when you're young. You're learning how to do things in a way that's very instinctual and intuitive. And having that, quote, natural kind of skill is something you carry with you your whole life that other generations probably don't get. We also know different ages and generations have different social networks. And I'm not necessarily, although I'm not excluding things like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and I'm TikTok, and there's a whole long list of ones I'm not hip enough to say, but I'm working on it. But social connections about who do you know, right? Who do you talk to? Who do you, if it's an older generation, like we would say, who did you used to have in your Rolodex, right? And for us now, it's who are you connected with on LinkedIn and you know, who would you feel free texting to ask a question to? We have different connections networks as well as informational networks. So what I want to know is, you know, if I have a problem or a question, where do I go to find the answer? It might be very different from where my colleague who's 20 years older than me goes, but not better necessarily, just different, right? And my student's probably going to check an entirely different place or network or tap into some different source. And what a fantastic ability for, you know, growth and innovation. And if we can combine those things. We know this because it can result in better decision-making, in better performance, if. And the if is like in capital letters. I should probably make an if slide because unfortunately, it doesn't happen naturally. So the reality is when this has been researched, age diversity, generational diversity in a team, in a workplace, doesn't naturally end in this very happy story and this picture I've painted of growth and learning and innovation. Usually it's a hot mess, and that might be the experience you've had where there's conflict, there's miscommunication, there's resentment. There's kind of this feeling inherent like us versus them. You know, this threat-based mentality that, you know, if things are changing too fast, then we as older generations sort of point to younger generations and say that's their fault. We don't like it. And younger generations, if they don't think things are changing fast enough, point the finger and say, well, if those older people would just get out of the way. And neither of those are very productive mindsets. And unfortunately, it's very easy to use this broad brush and not really understand in a complex way why there are those different perspectives. So I'm going to tell a quick story here. There's a client I'm working with who is really fantastic and very interested in understanding this in a deep level. And she shared that part of their struggle is they're trying to make progress on social justice issues in their organization, and very strong sentiment across ages, across, you know, different positions that this is an important thing to be talking about. But where they're having conflict is that they're finding that their younger employees, and again, I'm generalizing and I'm going to acknowledge I'm generalizing, but this is a trend they shared with me, that many of their younger employees want change to happen and they want it to happen now, immediately. Like tired of waiting, significant, bold action quickly, you know, enough is enough. And then more of their experienced or older employees are being more cautious, that they are interested in having the discussions and thinking about how to move things forward, but they want to do it on a slower time frame. They're being more maybe deliberate and want to kind of be more intentional about those actions. And the issue, again, it's not right or wrong, it's different. And the issue it's creating is that the younger employees are perceiving that and interpreting that slow hesitancy as not not supporting social justice issues. Whereas the older employees feel like the younger ones are maybe being too rash and not understanding that for change to really get traction, there's certain steps that need to be taken. There's certain research that has to be done. There's certain buy-in that has to be accomplished. And so they realized that this was in part a generational issue about, things like quick response time, immediate gratification, how long things take. And the answer, quote, answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Right? It probably could happen faster, but there's probably things that need to be slowed down to make sure they're done in a way that's going to stick. And so that's what Gentelligence is saying, can we agree we're headed in the same spot? And then if we know that, how might we all have different ways to get there, and how might that actually end up being more successful? So I always like to share at least a couple good headlines. I have hundreds, so it's hard for me to choose, but all you have to do is open up your news feed or your newspaper or whatever your news source of choice is these days, and you will see the clickbait horrible headlines. So this one in the middle was from McLean's 2020. I should have that cited there. I apologize, but it was from something that came out just a couple of years ago, kind of poking fun at the fact that we've created this generational war, whether it's fictional or real. There certainly is a lot of tension. Interestingly, so I freelance for NBC on generational topics. And so this last winter, they reached out to me and asked me for my take on the Super Bowl halftime show. And the Super Bowl halftime show, if you watched it or if you didn't, had a lot. It was supposed to be sort of a vintage throwback, which made me feel a little bit older than I thought I was, because I, obviously grew up with a lot of those entertainers. So a lot of the entertainers were Gen Xers. And right after the halftime show, someone tweeted, "That was the halftime show that millennials have been waiting for." And then there was this, debate that started raging on social media that, that wasn't the millennials halftime show, it was the Gen Xers halftime show. So kind of this ridiculous tug of war about who got credit. So NBC asked me to weigh in, and, I wrote what I thought was like a super positive, balanced piece about, this is the point of Gentelligence, that those performers were Gen Xers, like millennials were trying to take credit for Mary J. Blige, which they can't because she's a Gen Xer. But I said, this is Gen Xers created the music and the millennials grew up on it. And that's Gentelligence, right? That together we create this awesome thing that we can all enjoy. And isn't that fantastic? And I tried to kind of bring it back to this very positively framed place. And fun fact, when you write articles for outlets such as NBC News, the publication gets to pick your title. You as an author don't pick the title. So I never know the title of my piece until I wake up in the morning and it's been published. And so I woke up and the title of the piece was something like, war is raging between Gen Xers and millennials. Like it was like this, it's not even remotely like what I said in the piece, like, Gen X has had enough. Like it was this very contentious clickbait, right, is what it's for. And there's a lot of that going on in the media. So we find it, maybe entertaining, but it's certainly not productive. So what should we do instead? Let's kind of go to what we suggest in terms of practical tools. And of course, I have a lot more to share with you if you're interested, because obviously this is what I do these days, but I want to take you to what we call the 4 Gentelligence practices. So in writing our book, so as Kim said, I co-authored it with 2 former Miami alums, Josephine Nackam-Ekwall, who graduated in, I think, 18, and Brandon Fogel. I need to go back and see if that's right, but I'm pretty sure it's 18. And I love them. They're brilliant and added so much to this work, and still continue. I still continue to work with them. And when we wrote this, we wanted to have it be academically supported, but practically useful, right? That's a pretty hard balance to support. And in wanting to make sure it had practical tips and tools, we came up with these 4 practices, which are really based on best practices and things like cross-cultural management, diversity and inclusion, but applied to age. And when we were doing the Harvard Business Review piece and writing about these practices, our editors said, how is this different than good leadership? And we said, it's not. That's the point. It's good leadership applied to a topic and a kind of difference that we don't ever apply it to. So hopefully these won't be brand new ideas to you, but maybe you haven't thought about how they might apply specifically to generation and age, but today also the idea of generation, age, and gender. So the first one is resisting assumptions. So really identifying what assumptions are being made about your generation or age group by others that you feel are inaccurate, and how can you start to unpack those? And then what assumptions maybe implicitly or internally are you making without realizing it, right? What are you automatically connecting in your head? Bias is a shortcut, right? So, are you automatically assuming that your Gen Zs are only going to stay for 6 months? Are you assuming your baby boomers are packing their bags and ready to retire? There's a lot of assumptions going on right now about workplace arrangements, that Gen Zs don't want to work in an office and baby boomers do, and a lot of assumptions that are not research verified. But also, what do you assume other people understand or define the same way as you? That's been a super interesting conversation that I've had as well. So when you talk about women in age, for example, what are some of the concepts, like, for example, something like work-family balance? You can talk about the importance of work-family balance in your workplace. Obviously, always been a key issue for women. Does a 25-year-old or even a 35-year-old today define that the way a 45, a 55, a 65, a 75-year-old woman did? I know I'm the beneficiary of getting to look at work-family balance in a very different way than women in generations older than mine, right? They had to make choices that I didn't necessarily have to make. I read a really, what I thought was not a good article in The Atlantic last year that said millennials refuse to grow up. And when you dug into the article, they defined grow up as getting married, having children, buying a house. And I thought, there you go. You're assuming that the millennials define growing up the way you do and that they want the same things older generations, quote, wanted at those ages. And that's not necessarily a correct assumption. So starting to look at those things, right? And how does that affect things like women's balance, their career track, those kinds of questions. Let's not assume, let's start asking those questions. The second practice is what we call adjusting the lens, which is my favorite practice. And it's really all about understanding that we see the world through our own perspective. So my view on balance, on success, on mental health, on women's issues is influenced in part by the time in which I grew up. When I started here at Miami, I had some older colleagues who were women who took me aside and said, here's some of the things that you can expect later in your career, that you'll get so far, but you might not get any further. And I was sort of, taken back and worried. And I can say, thankfully for myself, that hasn't been my experience. And it's largely because of the road that they paved that it probably hasn't been my experience. But that doesn't mean other people my age haven't had that experience. I've shared with my students experiences I've had as a woman. One of my favorites is going to a conference where I was the keynote speaker. I was wearing this black dress, which I thought was cute. And I was standing by the buffet table. And this was 5 years ago, maybe, checking my phone. And it was a conference attended primarily by men, just because of the industry. And this very polite man came up after lunch and he thanked me for lunch. He said, "Thank you for lunch. It was delicious." And I sort of did this double take, and it was a very nice thing to say. And I was sort of caught off guard. So I said, "You're welcome." I mean, I didn't really actually make the lunch, but I figured I might as well claim it, right? I was like, "You're welcome." And I was really torn because it wasn't necessarily a big assumption on his part, because there were very few women at this conference, and most of the women were actually in like service roles. They were setting up, they were giving out name tags. And so maybe he just made the leap. And I also maybe look like a member of the catering staff in my dress. But I think, when I got up and was announced as the keynote speaker, his face just turned bright red and he came up and he apologized to me later. So I don't think it came from a bad place, but I shared that story with my students. And they were horrified. Both male and female students were horrified that in whatever that was, 2017, that happened, right? But that's That's a different story than I probably may have not been that keynote speaker, if we talk about a number of decades ago, at that particular conference. So again, it's very interesting to share those experiences and realize that your perspective is largely based on your view of the world. And you don't want to start judging people's reactions and behaviors based on your own view or your own lens. So just one more thing to say about that. I always say we share intrinsic values across every generation. We want to be respected. We want to feel connected. We want to have agency or autonomy over our work and our time and our life. But the norms that we learn on how to fulfill those or how to pursue them are very different based on the generation and the time in which we grew up. So if people just look at the norms or they look at the behavior, they don't think about the intent or what's driving them, you can miss some of those commonalities. So I always adjusting the lenses about that. All right. The third one, building trust. So once we sort of think about breaking down tension and bias, how do we get to this opportunity piece, right? These wonderful networks and difference in expertise that we can tap into. Part of it is about what we call psychological safety, super trendy term right now. But this idea that you have to create an environment where everyone feels safe to share ideas, give input, they feel valued and appreciated for who they are. And also feel safe asking for help. I mean, we're seeing this great resignation right now. I get a lot of questions about that because of what I teach. People are leaving their jobs because they don't feel appreciated. That's the number one reason people leave their job. They don't feel seen and they don't feel appreciated for the unique value. And of course, generational perspective, gender, the interaction of that and every other layer of who you are comes into play. And so how do we create an environment where we agree we're all here for the same mission? And the fact that we have different ways to accomplish it or different perspectives or different tools is actually a good thing, right? And that I want you to ask questions. I ask questions all the time. And it might be to the 18-year-old sitting outside my door, or it might be to, my 72-year-old colleague who's been doing this since before I was alive. Like, it just kind of depends on what it is I want to learn, but valuing that and letting them know that I value that input makes them much more willing to, I think, listen and value mine. And then finally, our fourth practice, which we call expanding the pie. That's a term from negotiation. This is not a competition. This us versus them like threat we feel that young people are taking all the jobs or older people need to retire because they're hogging all the jobs or, is not productive. It sometimes feels very real, and I'm not saying it's not real, but it's not productive to be viewing it as sort of a contentious competition. And we have to step away from that. If I didn't view you as in competition with me, but as somebody who might actually be able to help us all be more successful, how might that change how I interact with you, right? Collaborating instead of competing and valuing the unique perspective that you bring to the table. So that kind of brings us to the end. The mantra of Gentelligence is that every generation has something they can learn as well as something they can teach those who are older and younger. And when it comes to women specifically, the kind of extra layer we're talking about today, I thought a lot about this. One of the practical tools we suggest is something we call mutual mentorship. So of course, we've heard of reverse mentorship and mentorship. But we like mutual mentorship, right? The idea that it's a two-way street, that there's so many interesting things we could learn from each other. And we all know the power of mentorship, specifically for women. What would mutual mentorship look like, right? If our alums and our students had sort of not just one-way mentorship, but mutual mentorship. I think that would be a fascinating empowerment, culture to be able to create. I think about all of the women that I've learned from, whether it's on the Miami Women Board, whether it's, the women that are just now graduating this last weekend and heading out into the workplace, all that rich Miami history and tradition and of course the rich future, what could we all learn if we were able to sort of take that mentality of learning together? And so that's the question I want to leave you with. What are the key insights that women in particular of different ages and generations can learn and teach one another, right? What are those lessons or those opportunities that we could share if we had this belief that it should be a two-way street and that there's value in those differences. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. So last, just to wrap it up, so I leave time for questions. We were really honored to have Gentelligence and this idea of harnessing age diversity featured in Harvard Business Review in March. It was featured as their big idea piece. And Josephine and Brandon co-authored that with me as well. It's based on our book, but they had us take it in a little bit different direction around specifically age. And it's just been great to see the people who have decided to jump into this conversation in their workplace, and just really hoping that we get people to think a little bit more about it. I'm going to share 2 quick resources with you if you are interested, given we only had an hour today. Would love to continue to share with you some of the things that we're doing. First and foremost, we have just launched what we call Gentelligence Academy. So we had been getting requests from people who said, I want to learn more. Is there a way to become certified, to signal to people that I'm someone who understands this value and why this matters? And so we launched Gentelligence Academy in March. That QR code there will take you to it, or it's just gentelligenceacademy.com. You can learn more, get a seat in there. It's a remote learning platform. It's a great sort of continual learning activity. So that's been a really fun new adventure. And then if you are interested in just hearing more about once a month, I try to post a blog post or send out what's new or interesting things that are going on in the area of age diversity specifically. And that QR code will take you to sign up for that. I don't send out something more than like once a month if I get around to that. So not too much stuff filling up your inbox, but enjoy staying connected to people like you who tune in on their lunch hour to learn more. And just a fun fact, my co-authors created those QR codes for me because I'm 45 and I still don't understand how to make QR codes. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is what Gentelligence is for. So I thank them for creating my QR codes for me. And there's the link if you're not a QR code person. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kim and see if we've got questions we want to field.
Hi, yes, we do. And again, Megan, Josephine and Brandon were class of 18, and Josephine, my apologies for your last name here, but this is the book that she referenced as well. That if you have not read it, I highly recommend it. A lot of great insights as well as just entertaining in general. I did get a comment from Michelle Black Abrams, who said that she served as an RA and house chairman in McBride Hall when Dean Brown was Dean of Women. She was in charge of hours for the women's dorms because, yes, they had hours that they had to keep. The men's did not. And working the bell desk in the early 70s, like 70 to 72. So, Michelle, thanks for sharing that with us. And thanks for tuning in today. Megan, I love the idea of this mutual mentorship in what we can learn from each other in those different ages. It isn't just that one-way street, right, of the older, telling the younger what to do. I feel like as a Gen Xer and a working mom, I learned a lot on both sides from those older than me and those that came behind me about how to manage that and work that well and say, this is an acceptable thing to do. So I really love that idea. I also love your idea that good leadership is really just, that's what this is, and it's applied to a topic. But there have been a lot of comments that say that really age is something that is overlooked in company diversity and inclusion statements. And they find that, someone commented here is that age diversity, hiring workers over 50 is really lacking in hiring that tout, diversity and inclusion. So, I think others are seeing that as well as the comment that you made here is that it's there. It's just not something that people have been giving that attention to.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that in the US specifically, there is, of course, federal legislation that prohibits age discrimination for those 40 and older.
Right.
My students are shocked that they are not covered by age discrimination legislation. That's one of the topics I talk about when we talk about HR, is I say, like, are you covered by age discrimination legislation? Yes, no. This is obviously my undergrads who are not 40 or older. We talk about why, right? That we create laws to protect people that we feel like might be denied opportunities that they deserve. And that legislation was designed when it didn't seem likely that younger people would be denied opportunities. Now, research doesn't support that reverse age discrimination or discrimination against people because of a young age is actually very highly reported. It's reported actually as much, if not a little bit more, than age discrimination by those who are older in age. It's just not federally protected. There are some states that actually outlaw it, and in a lot of places in Europe, it's not legal. But our federal laws only protect people 40 and older. And then interestingly, I mean, I think it's interesting, obviously. Interestingly, if you're over 40 and you feel like somebody older than you got an opportunity that you should have gotten, based on their older age, you are not protected. So the Supreme Court had to rule on that a while ago, that it's designed to protect the older person in the scenario, not the younger one, even if they're over 40. So it is interesting. I've been hearing from a lot of colleagues who are over 50 who want to get a new opportunity, post-COVID, or I don't know if we can say post-COVID yet, knock on wood. Are looking for their next chapter. They want to go, they don't want to retire. They're not ready to retire, but maybe they're looking for something better, or they feel more valued and are feeling like their age is a hindrance. That's part of why we created the Gentelligence certification. And it's really hard to prove that your age is the reason that you're not getting hired. Often it's like skills, things like that.
Well, that's a question that somebody asked here. So if you're looking, if you're over the age of 50 or over an age here, and you're looking to maybe get into a new field that has maybe these different skills. So you've got all this managerial experience, but you don't have coding or whatever it might be. Is that something they should really take into consideration, learning some of these additional things and not just relying on their years of experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really helpful is to think about what are the hesitations people might be having. Now, obviously, I just said that your age should not be used as a form of discrimination. So if you feel like it is specifically, that's obviously something to think about. But it's hard to separate age from, well, you don't have the skill set we're looking for, right? That becomes very sticky. So I think two things. I think we are in the, as you and I know, because we've looked at it a lot here in higher ed, we are in the crux of certifications and badges, and you can get badged and certified in just about any skill without necessarily having to go back for a lengthy or expensive degree program. So there are a lot of platforms where you can basically what we call upskill. So if there's a job you're interested in and it's showing a requirement for a set of skills you don't have because they weren't required when you started your job, that's one option, right? Is to go ahead and engage and say, well, great, I'm going to refresh my skills. That's something, upskilling and reskilling are, of course, huge trendy things right now that all of us are going to need to do, not just older employees. And younger employees, I think, believe and understand they will always need to be upskilling. Whereas many of us, when we start our career, we're like, well, now I'm done with that part. Now I can just go work, right? Like we weren't our norm wasn't that we were going to continually need, other than like maybe tuning in once a year to a conference to get a credit for something, that it wouldn't be as continual learning as it's going to be. So I think one, suggestion would be, if you're up for it, certification, digital badges, and whatever it is you're interested in. That's part one. Part two, I think, is when you engage in the interview, talking about your interest and your passion for learning and development, because a stereotype is that older people aren't interested in learning things new. It's not a supported stereotype. It's just an unfortunate stereotype. And in fact, I had a client I was on a meeting with not talking about Gentelligence, something else. And they said, well, we're doing this upskilling program. And I said, well, how many people can we expect? And they said, well, probably we're going to offer it to everybody, probably not our baby boomers. You know who you're talking to? And I said, hold on, there's a practice here that we're violating, full stop. What's that about? And they gave me this anecdotal answer that Anne in the workroom had mentioned over coffee that she sure hoped she didn't have to take that class. And Anne happened to be a baby boomer. I was like, okay, well, policies are not driven by Anne, right? Yeah. I'm sure there's tons of older workers, baby boomers, older Gen Xers that would love to have that opportunity. And legally, you need to offer it to them, but also just because you want to keep them engaged, they want to continue to develop and learn skills as well. That's part of job satisfaction. And so I think thinking about the fact, if the perception is I'm not interested in learning, not willing to learn, that I'm going to come in and tell people how it should be done because I've been doing this a long time. If that's not the case for you, then you neutralize that. I'm really looking forward to learning from my new colleagues. I'm looking forward to learning new things. Like, I'd be open to any kind of training and development that's available to me. Being open to learning, which in my experience in the research would support most older employees is the concern, I think, that tends to get in people's way, even if it's unfounded. Right. So anything you can do to kind of, pull that elephant out of the room and say, often people might think somebody my age and level of experience isn't interested in new learning opportunities. And that's just definitely not the case for me.
Great. No, thank you for that. I think it's some really good advice. And I think, so we're talking about if I'm an older person in the workforce, some things that I can do. You talked about the upskilling and how to frame it. What if I'm on the other end of that? How can I bring those colleagues in? How can I make my work environment more a friendly place for these older adults? And what do you recommend to those on the younger end of the generations here as they're looking to get into a new job, or if they're in their work environment?
Yeah. So I've written about this in a couple places. It a little bit depends on the challenge. So I think when we talk about a younger person, we know our statistics are showing that 40% of people are saying they're reporting to somebody younger than them, that their boss is younger than them. So that's a trend we're seeing. Yeah. And that could be tough on both ends. So I think as a younger person, again, what are the stereotypes people take in to the workplace or tend to think about younger people, right? That they're entitled, that they're impatient, that they are fickle and will job hop. And a lot of those are unfounded. They will leave jobs if they don't feel developed or supported or valued, which all of us will, but they're a lot more vocal about the fact that they're going to leave and why. And that's often where that comes from. But we often talk about, if you're managing somebody or working with somebody older, don't make yourself smaller and act like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. Sorry, I'm your boss. You've earned that position, particularly women. That's really important, right? I always say, don't make yourself small. You're be confident that you've earned that spot, but you can be confident that you deserve the spot and still be willing to ask questions and learn. And that's a big leadership sort of fallacy, that you have to have it all figured out and shouldn't ask for help and advice. So thinking about, how can I tap into this experience and expertise that shows to this older person that they're valued and we appreciate them, and not necessarily feel like I don't deserve my spot or that I'm not capable of leading. Those aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
Love to get your perspective, would love to get your advice, would love to hear your input on this. You can ask for input without giving over the keys to making the decisions. I think that's really helpful for inclusion, is sort of valuing the different perspectives on both ends that people bring to the table.
Absolutely. Well, we are out of time. And so, Megan, I want to thank you so much again for joining us today. Thanks to all of you that are watching. This will be available later on to watch again, to share with friends. And as Megan mentioned, there was a previous webinar that she did with her co-authors that you can also find on our site. We have another live webinar tomorrow, May 18th at noon, The State of the College Student, Tips for Today and Preparation for Tomorrow, featuring our Dean of Students and the Vice President of Health and Wellness. And you can register online up until the broadcast. And please remember to check out Miami Women at miamioh.edu/Miami Women to learn more about this reinvigorated program, our regional and virtual events, and how you can join our Giving Circle. On behalf of the Miami University Alumni Association, thank you, Megan, for joining us, and thanks to all of you. Love and honor. Goodbye.